A digging crew made a startling discovery while working to reinstate an old quarry. This large, abandoned pit had been neglected for over 2 decades. But as the demand for stone increased with the booming housing market, a crew was assigned to clear out the rubble and make it operational again. They were prepared for long days of hauling rock, but what they found would shake them to the core. The operation began smoothly. For 2 days, the crew focused on removing overgrown vegetation and loose debris from the quarry. By the 3rd day, they started digging in earnest, using heavy machinery to break up rock and deepen the quarry. It was on this day that they encountered something completely unexpected. As the crane dug deeper into the quarry, it struck something solid, producing a loud, metallic clang. This wasn't the sound of rock or soil being moved, this was metal against metal. The entire crew paused, surprised by the noise, and gathered around the hole that had just been dug. They peered down and caught sight of a faint metallic glimmer. Whatever it was, it certainly didn't belong in the ground. The crew leader, Carl, instructed his team to grab shovels and smaller tools to help unearth the mysterious object. As they dug, they saw that it was much larger than they initially thought. What started as a small glimpse of metal quickly revealed itself as a large, cylindrical structure buried beneath the soil. After several hours of careful digging, they uncovered the object's edges, exposing a yellowish metal with signs of corrosion from years underground. The diameter alone was over 5 feet, and they guessed it went even deeper into the ground. Deciding they needed more power, Carl called for the crane to lift the object out. Slowly, the strange metal structure was hoisted from its underground tomb, revealing more of its corroded surface. When it was finally free of the earth, it stood between them like an ancient relic. Upon closer inspection, Carl noticed that the object wasn't just a random piece of scrap metal. It had 2 doors on opposite sides, each with a handle. Curiosity got the better of Carl, and he reached out to pull the handle of one door. To his surprise, it opened easily. The door led into a small chamber, about 3 feet deep, with another door directly opposite it. Carl quickly realized this was no ordinary chamber. This was a tunnel door, likely used in the past to reinforce underground passages and protect workers as they moved through excavated areas. The rest of the crew gathered around, watching with a mix of intrigue and unease. Carl walked out of the metal chamber and looked back at the hole from which they had pulled the door. A dark tunnel stretched down into the ground, a tunnel that no one had expected to find. "All right, we're going in," Carl announced, his voice carrying both caution and excitement. He signaled for the crew to grab their flashlights. Some hesitated, reluctant to venture into the unknown depths, but one by one they followed their leader. The tunnel walls were remarkably well preserved, with smooth, precise cuts that suggested skilled workmanship. Dust and cobwebs hung in the air, but there was a sense that the tunnel had been intentionally maintained at some point in the past. After a few minutes, some of the younger workers became uneasy. A man named Mark spoke up, saying, "I'm not staying down here another second." A few others nodded in agreement, fear etched on their faces. Without protest, Carl let them leave, understanding their discomfort. Now left with only a handful of crew members, Carl pressed forward, encouraging them to stick together. "If you're in, stay close. We've come this far, and we need to know what we found," he urged. As they continued down the passage, Carl noticed that the tunnel began to narrow, and the wooden beams reinforcing the walls grew closer together. Oddly, there were colored markings on the beams, consistent symbols, each in a different shade. Carl couldn't shake the feeling that they were being guided somewhere, as if the tunnel had been designed to lead them toward a specific destination. "Let's keep it quiet," he whispered as they moved deeper into the tunnel. Suddenly, the tunnel veered sharply to the right, and as they turned the corner, they found themselves in a vast underground chamber. It was enormous, larger than the ground floor of Carl's own house. They crawled through the narrow passage and emerged into the room, where strange markings covered the stone walls, and old tools lay scattered around as if left there by someone years ago. One of the crew members whispered, "What is this place? And why is all this stuff here?" He looked to Carl for answers, but Carl was just as baffled. He walked toward a pile of tools covered in dust and brushed some of it away, revealing a faint symbol on one of the pieces of equipment. The mark seemed familiar to him, but he couldn't place where he'd seen it before. just as he began pondering the symbol's meaning. A distant sound echoed through the chamber, the sound of footsteps, growing louder. The crew tensed, realizing that they were not alone. The footsteps grew clearer, and Carl motioned for everyone to hide behind a set of large boulders. They dimmed their flashlights, holding their breath as the sound came closer. Within moments, a group of elderly men shuffled into the chamber. They wore faded, worn-out work clothes, and each man appeared to be at least 60 years old. Their faces were lined and weary, and their hair had turned silver with age. The sight of these old men, in such an isolated place, left Carl and his crew in utter disbelief. One of Carl's men leaned over, whispering, Who are they?" The elderly men seemed oblivious to the crew hiding behind the rocks, and they carried on with their routine, lighting lanterns around the room, which gradually filled the chamber with a warm, flickering glow. As the light spread, the crew could see makeshift beds crafted from old mining carts and other equipment. The beds were worn but looked functional, as if they had been used regularly. Suddenly, one of Carl's team members let out a faint gasp, unable to contain his shock. The sound was barely audible, but it was enough to catch the attention of one of the elderly men. He stopped what he was doing and turned sharply, his gaze locking onto the dark corner where Carl's crew was hidden. "Who's there?" the man called out in a voice that held both authority and curiosity. Carl raised a hand, signaling his team to stay still, but it was too late. They'd been heard. The elderly man slowly began walking toward them, lantern held high. The other men in the chamber looked up, alerted by his voice, but none of them seemed alarmed. Carl realized that whoever these men were, they didn't appear hostile, just surprised. The old man stopped a few feet away, looking into the shadows where Carl and his crew crouched. Then he called out in a surprisingly gentle tone, "It's all right. You don't need to hide. We're not here to harm you." Carl hesitated, but he sensed no threat. After a quick glance at his team, he nodded, and they cautiously stepped out from behind the rocks. The old man lifted his lantern higher, illuminating the faces of Carl and his crew. He offered a slight smile as he said, "Well, it's been a long time since we've seen anyone new down here. My name is John." Carl took a step forward and extended his hand, which John shook firmly, his weathered grip strong despite his age. "I'm Carl," he said. "We're part of a digging crew working to reinstate the quarry above. We weren't expecting to find, well, any of this." John's eyes widened at Carl's words, and he exchanged glances with the other elderly men. "The quarry. They finally opened it back up," he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The other men looked equally shocked, as if Carl had just announced something unimaginable. "Yes," Carl replied. "We hit this tunnel door by accident while digging, but if you don't mind me asking, who are you all? And how long have you been down here?" John's face softened, and he took a deep breath before replying. "We're what's left of a mining crew that worked this site decades ago. There was an earthquake, you see. It hit hard, collapsing several tunnels and cutting off our only exit. Most of the workers made it out, but we were the ones left behind." A somber silence fell over the chamber as Carl and his crew took in the weight of John's words. "We tried digging ourselves out," John continued, "but with the tunnels sealed off and no outside help, we had no choice but to survive here as best we could." Carl's brow furrowed in disbelief. "But that must have been years ago." 30 years, John replied quietly, his voice barely a whisper. The other elderly men around him nodded, their faces lined with decades of hardship and solitude. How did you survive all this time?" one of Carl's crew members blurted out, unable to hide his shock. John glanced at his companions before explaining. "When we realized rescue wasn't coming, we scavenged the supplies that were stored here: canned goods, preserved rations. There was enough to sustain us, especially with only 8 of us left. We rationed carefully, made every bit count. But the hardest part wasn't the hunger or the isolation, it was the waiting. The hope that someday someone might come." Carl's heart ached as he listened, and he noticed that a tear had rolled down John's cheek. The rest of the old miners watched quietly, their expressions weary but strangely peaceful, as though they had long ago come to terms with their fate. After a moment, Carl said, "You're saying no one even tried to find you? Not even in the beginning?" John shook his head slowly. "I imagine they assumed we were lost in the collapse, and after the mine was closed, it seems we were just forgotten." He looked down, his voice choked with sadness. "We've made our peace with it as much as we could, but it hasn't been easy." Carl looked at his team, and he could see the same determination reflected in their eyes. These men had been trapped for 30 years, forgotten, left to survive on their own. But now, finally, someone had found them. "We're not going to leave you down here," Carl said firmly. "We'll get you out, I promise." John's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. The other miners exchanged looks of astonishment, scarcely able to believe what they were hearing. "Come with us," Carl urged. "We'll help you out of this place." With Carl and his team leading the way, the elderly miners gathered their few belongings, and together they began the long walk back through the tunnel. The atmosphere was tense yet hopeful. For the first time in 30 years, John and his crew could see a future beyond these dark, damp walls. The trek back was slow, with Carl and his team supporting the older men as they navigated the tunnel. When they finally emerged into the daylight, a collective sigh of relief swept over them. Some of the miners shielded their eyes, unused to the brightness of the sun after so many years underground. Once above ground, Carl and his team quickly arranged for medical assistance. News of the miners' discovery spread rapidly, and soon reporters arrived, eager to capture the unbelievable story of survival. The elderly miners were taken to a hospital, where they were given food, warmth, and rest. Many of them hadn't seen a proper bed in decades, and the relief on their faces was evident as they settled into their new surroundings. The following weeks were filled with emotional reunions. Some of the miners still had family members who had long believed them lost. The tears, laughter, and hugs shared during these reunions were a testament to the strength of family bonds and the resilience of the human spirit. For Carl and his crew, the experience was life-changing. They had gone to the quarry to reinstate an old worksite, but they had returned with a story that would become a national sensation. They were hailed as heroes, and their story was shared across the country. When Carl was asked about the experience, he simply said, "We just did what anyone else would have done. We couldn't leave them down there. They survived so much it was the least we could do." The quarry itself was permanently closed, deemed too dangerous to ever be reopened. But Carl and his team didn't mind. They had completed their mission, not the one they had set out to do, but one far more important.